Okay, so we'll take a look at where the preganglionic neurons are located and where the ganglia are. Okay, so for the parasympathetic, we said we want to know where the preganglionic neurons are located. So for the parasympathetic is also called the craniosacral division. Okay, and so why am I telling you that now? Well, because this name actually tells you where the preganglionic neurons are. Okay, the preganglionic neurons will travel with 4 cranial nerves. Okay, and they also are located in the lower part of the spinal cord in the sacral region of the spinal cord. Okay, from S2 through S4. Okay, so I will repeat that. Okay, so for the parasympathetic division, it is also called the craniosacral division because the preganglionic neurons travel with 4 cranial nerves, and I will tell you what they are. We're actually going to go over them. They are cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10. Okay, and we're going to talk about them again, so don't worry if you're not getting it all. 3, 7, 9, and 10. And then also, if you take a look here at the spinal cord, notice how some of these parasympathetic neurons are way down here in the bottom of the cord. This is called the sacral region of the spinal cord because these axons are going to come down and travel out through the sacrum. So they're sacral spinal nerves. And so these are going to also, these levels will also have preganglionic parasympathetic neurons that are going to come out and go to some of the organs, mostly down in the pelvic region. Okay, the organs that are way down there. Okay, so notice these are the 4 cranial nerves I was just talking about, 3, 7, 9, and 10. So if you look, you can see how these preganglionic neuron cell bodies are located somewhere here in the brainstem. And those 4 cranial nerves carry their axons out to different tissues in the head area. But notice here, for cranial nerve 10, this is the vagus nerve. Notice how long these axons are because they're going to come down and go to organs that are in the thoracic and abdominal cavities. Okay, so the vagus nerve is a really important nerve that you guys will talk about a lot when you take physiology. Okay, so now you might be thinking, well, but we already talked about the cranial nerves and she didn't mention any of this. I didn't get into this because it's just so much. So I didn't really want to talk about all of the parasympathetic neurons along with the other neurons that the cranial nerves carry. So today we will just add the parasympathetic to those cranial nerves, okay? So notice here in this diagram, this is showing you different organs that these neurons are going to supply, and you'll see this looks pretty much the same for the sympathetic. Okay, so you can see where these are going to end up would be going to, again, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands in our organs. Okay? For the parasympathetic, one thing that you can see when you look at this diagram is you can see how long the preganglionic neurons are, because notice they're shown in brown, and you can see how they look like they're going pretty much all the way out to the organ, and they actually do. The ganglia for the parasympathetic are located right in the organ or right next to the organ. So the postganglionic neurons are actually, you have to look closely for them because they're so short. They're shown in gray, and they're the little tiny short neurons here that would just go from the ganglion right into the smooth muscle or cardiac muscle or the glands.
Is there a reason why the parasympathetic ganglions are so far away, or like so close to the organs, or is there any benefits to that in comparison to the sympathetic?
I think it just has to do with the way that the parasympathetic works. The parasympathetic division gives us really like fine tuning, meaning that like you can be salivating, you know, when you're like seeing food or smelling food, or especially if you're hungry, you get that watery feeling in your mouth, but you don't necessarily have to, you know, go to the bathroom at the same time. You know what I mean? So The effects of the parasympathetic are more, give us better control. There's more of a one-on-one ratio between the preganglionic and the postganglionic neurons. So I think because of that, it makes sense for these preganglionic to go all the way out and just synapse right there in the organ on their postganglionic. Where the sympathetic is a little different. When we're in a fight or flight mode, we don't really need that really fine control over all of those effects. We want all of those effects to happen together because that's what will prepare us the best for being able to run away or fight for our life. So we want all of those different things to happen all at once. So like maybe one preganglionic sympathetic neuron will synapse on many postganglionic. So the effect is very broad. And so their ganglia are set up differently. I don't know if that really, oh, okay. I don't know if I explained it well, but I think it just has to do with how the parasympathetic works is why it's, why it looks this way. So let's talk about those 4 cranial nerves. So what I'd like you to know is just what their parasympathetic neurons do, okay? So let's take a look at the cranial nerves real quick, okay? And if you guys, I know you probably don't know all of the cranial nerves right now, but you will, right? As you study them, you will get all of those different functions of the cranial nerves down, and you can just add these to those 4, okay? So we said that the oculomotor nerve controls most of our extrinsic eye muscles. These are the muscles that insert on the outside of the eyeball, and they move the eye around when we're looking around in our visual field. So inside the eye, we have smooth muscle that controls the size of our pupil and the shape of the lens. And so that is what's controlled by the parasympathetic. This is called the intrinsic eye muscle because it's inside the eye, and it is smooth muscle. So the parasympathetic neurons that travel with cranial nerve 3 go to the intrinsic eye muscle. Okay, the other motor neurons go to the extrinsic eye muscles. Okay, so for the facial nerve, cranial nerve 7, this nerve also carries parasympathetic neurons. The parasympathetic control 2 of our salivary glands. Okay, these are called major salivary glands because they're big. We have 3 pairs of major salivary glands. This nerve contains or carries parasympathetic neurons that go to 2 of those. Okay, and then the glossopharyngeal nerve or cranial nerve 9. Oh, I'm sorry, and also the facial nerve also carries parasympathetic neurons to the lacrimal gland, okay, causing the secretion of tears. Okay, so cranial nerve 9, the glossopharyngeal, carries parasympathetic neurons that go to the one other major salivary gland. It's the one that's right here. We sometimes feel the secretion of this when you bite into certain things. Okay, and we'll talk about those salivary glands more when we get into the digestive system. Okay, and then finally the vagus nerve. This one again is really important because this is the nerve that carries parasympathetic neurons to all of our organs of the thoracic and abdominal cavities. So if you guys review, when you review these, you will see that this is the cranial nerve that carried sensory information from our organs. Okay, so it's taking the sensory information from the organs, also carrying the parasympathetic neurons that go out to those organs. Okay, to the smooth muscle, the cardiac muscle, and the glands in those organs. So this is the nerve that really is responsible for controlling how those organs are functioning. So you guys will talk about this a lot when you take physiology. The vagus nerve will be important for you. Okay? So again, preganglionic neurons travel with 4 cranial nerves, also come from the sacral region of the spinal cord from S2 through S4. That is why it's called craniosacral. Okay, questions on that before we go on? Okay, so where are the ganglia? The ganglia for the parasympathetic actually is super easy because the ganglia are located right at the organ. So they are called terminal ganglia because they're at the termination of the pathway. And that's all you need to know. Do they have their own individual names? Of course, because as you guys know, everything does. But as a group, they're called terminal ganglia, and that's all you need to know. So, oops, let's go back to that for just a second. So, if you look closely, you can see that it looks like these neurons are synapsing way out here at the organ. So these are all terminal ganglia. Notice there are some ganglia in the head that have different names. You can see they are labeled here. You do not have to know their names. Okay, you don't have to know these names. So just know that these ganglia for parasympathetic are terminal ganglia. Okay? So parasympathetic, terminal. Okay? And it's just that easy. Okay, so we're going to talk about the sympathetic now. So let's take a look at where the sympathetic preganglionic neurons are located. The sympathetic division is also called thoracolumbar. Thoracolumbar. Okay, so again, I think it's good to memorize these names because these names will tell you where the preganglionic neurons are. So the preganglionic sympathetic neurons are located in the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord. Okay, let's take a look at that. Oops. And that is shown here. Okay, so this is sympathetic. Notice it looks kind of the same as the last picture because we see all the same tissues that are supplied by these neurons. Okay, but notice where these neurons are coming from now. They're coming from kind of the middle part of the spinal cord. This is T1 through L2 levels of the cord. So if we were to look at a cross-section through the spinal cord, at one of these levels here, we would see the preganglionic neuron cell bodies in the lateral horn of the gray matter. Okay? Remember, they're in the lateral horn of the gray matter from T1 through L2. So thoracolumbar. Okay. Now let's talk about where the ganglia are located for the sympathetic. Notice that traveling alongside the spinal cord here, we have this kind of long chain of ganglia. This is called the sympathetic trunk. A lot of these neurons will synapse there, and you can follow these out and you can see where this shows them synapsing here on their postganglionic neurons. But notice that for the organs here in the abdominal region, it is a little different. These preganglionic neurons will go through the sympathetic trunk without synapsing. They'll go to one of these ganglia here. So these ganglia here are actually located in the abdominal cavity. Okay? These are called collateral ganglia. There's one more possible pathway. If you follow this preganglionic neuron, notice how it's going through the sympathetic trunk, then it goes through this collateral ganglion, but it's coming all the way over to the adrenal gland, which sits on top of the kidney. So some of these neurons will actually go to the adrenal gland. They'll synapse in the adrenal gland on little short postganglionic neurons, but instead of secreting the neurotransmitter onto another neuron, they will secrete it into the blood, and it becomes a hormone called adrenaline. So when we have a fight or flight response, we always will have the secretion of adrenaline along with it, because that will give us kind of a prolonged response that will give us more time to, run away or protect ourselves. The hormones take longer to be broken down because it's released into the blood. So this gives us a longer response time. Okay, so let's list these ganglia for the sympathetic division. Okay, so first of all, again, some of these will synapse in the sympathetic trunk. organs in the abdominal region, we have those collateral ganglia. And I would like you to know their names. Okay, so there is a celiac ganglion. And these are actually named after blood vessels that they are next to. And you guys will have to know the names of those blood vessels anyway. Okay, there's a superior mesenteric ganglion and an inferior mesenteric ganglion. Okay, so these are the collateral ganglia in the abdominal cavity. Okay, and then there's that one other place where some of them will synapse, and that is in the adrenal, I'm gonna put this over here, adrenal medulla. Okay, so what is the medulla? Well, the adrenal gland sits on top of the kidney, kind of like a little hat. So here's our kidney, and it's kind of like a pyramid-shaped gland. The center of it is the adrenal medulla. This part of the gland secretes adrenaline. The outer part, called the cortex, secretes different hormones. So this is where those preganglionic neurons are going to go, and they'll synapse on the little postganglionic neurons here that release adrenaline.
Are we gonna have to know exactly what the synapses look like a diagram?
No.
for the test?
No, so this is what I want you to know. I want you to know that the preganglionic neurons exit the spinal cord from T1 through T12, or T1 through L2. And I want you to know that these are the ganglia, okay? That's it. You don't have to know what each, possible pathway would look like. You don't have to know that. Okay, there is one more thing though I want to show you guys for the sympathetic division, and I just want to show you how did these neurons go in and out of the sympathetic trunk to synapse there. So let's take a quick look at a diagram that shows the sympathetic trunk. This is from an actual cadaver. And you can also see this on that long model, so I'll show that to you in a minute. Okay, so here we have some cross sections through the spinal cord. This would be anywhere between T1 and L2. This is what it would look like. So notice again, you see the preganglionic neuron cell body in the lateral horn of the gray matter. Because these are all motor neurons, the axon always travels on the anterior root of the spinal nerve. Okay, so that's going to now come together with the posterior root here, so this is the actual spinal nerve. Okay, so how does this neuron go into the sympathetic trunk to synapse? Here we have the sympathetic trunk. Notice there's these little connectors here. This is what I said earlier we would come back to, okay, because they're for autonomic neurons. So the preganglionic neuron is going to go through this little connection here, the one that's more lateral. Okay, that is called the white ramus. Sometimes called the white ramus communicans, but you can just say white ramus. This is called the white ramus because these preganglionic neurons are myelinated. Okay, so that is the white ramus. So that carries that preganglionic neuron into the sympathetic trunk. It's going to synapse on the postganglionic neuron, shown in gray. And that postganglionic neuron now is going to go back out to the spinal nerve. It's going to travel through that little connection there. This is called the gray ramus. The gray ramus is more medial. So why would this be called the gray ramus? Because these postganglionic neurons are actually unmyelinated. Okay? So that is the gray ramus. Okay, so white ramus and gray ramus. And those are only for the sympathetic neurons. Okay, so this diagram will be on the test. You guys should be able to identify everything on this because we talk about everything, right? the parts of the spinal cord, the parts of the spinal nerve, the sympathetic trunk, and the white and gray rami. Mhm.
For gray ramus, is that pointing at the blue part of
The gray ramus is this.
the short branch?
Yeah, it's the little short, so remember that the little connections, like the little branches of the spinal nerve are called rami. So these are both called rami. The one that's more lateral is the white ramus, and the one that's more medial is the gray. Okay. Any other questions on any of that? You can see this on these two spinal cord models. So these pink things here, traveling along the side of the spinal cord, this is the sympathetic trunk. So these are all the ganglia in the sympathetic trunk. You can even see the white and gray rami. They're kind of small on this. I wouldn't ask you to identify them here, but you should be able to identify them in the diagram. And this is not showing it on this other side, but it would be located on both sides. Okay? And you can also see this here on this model. So this model shows a spinal nerve, right? It shows the roots of the spinal nerve where the two roots come together. You can see them better on this side. There's the anterior root, posterior root. This is the posterior root ganglion, the big thing here. Where the two roots come together, that would be the spinal nerve. So this thing that's coming off and going back posteriorly, this would be the posterior ramus of the spinal nerve. This is the anterior ramus of the spinal nerve. Okay, so now notice that here we have this little thing traveling alongside of the spinal cord. This is the sympathetic trunk. This is one of the ganglia here of the sympathetic trunk. So you could identify this as the sympathetic trunk. You could just say sympathetic ganglion. And this is actually, technically, this is the gray ramus. And this is because this is up in the cervical region, and in the cervical region, we have the gray rami that would take that postganglionic neuron back to the spinal nerve. There are no white rami up in the cervical region, but that's kind of a technicality that I don't really want to get that detailed with it. So just know this is a sympathetic ramus, okay? This is a sympathetic ramus for that sympathetic neuron, and that is the sympathetic trunk. Okay? Okay, so that is the sympathetic division. When you look at these diagrams, figure 18.8, it will show you a few different pictures of this, and the neurons will follow a slightly different path. It's because it's showing you what it would look like if we're looking at, you know, like an organ in the abdominal region or an organ in the thoracic cavity. You don't need to memorize all those pathways. Just know what we just talked about here. Okay, sympathetic trunk, white ramus, gray ramus. That's it. Okay, so the neurotransmitters are actually super easy because most of the autonomic neurons secrete acetylcholine. Okay, so make a little table here. So let's talk about the preganglionic and postganglionic. Okay, and we'll put parasympathetic and sympathetic. Okay, so for both the parasympathetic and the sympathetic, the preganglionic neurons will all secrete acetylcholine. Okay, the postganglionic parasympathetic also secrete acetylcholine. So the only neurons that secrete a different neurotransmitter would be the postganglionic sympathetic. They secrete a neurotransmitter called norepinephrine, abbreviated NE. This is actually similar to adrenaline. Chemically, it's very similar to adrenaline. Okay, so norepinephrine. And this is on your study guide on the first page. Some of you were asking me about this. So There you go, okay? Secreted by the postganglionic sympathetic neurons. If the postganglionic neurons both secreted the same neurotransmitter, then these neurons would have the same effect on their target organ, but they have a different effect because they secrete a different neurotransmitter. So that is the difference in the way that the sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons affect our organs. Okay, so that is it. Okay, guys, so we can review. If you really do not want to review, that's fine. You